Okay, everyone, let's get started. So I'm James. I'm a postdoc here at eScience, and thank you for coming to the Data That and Now lecture series. This is a lecture series that's co-sponsored by eScience, by Human-Centered Design and Engineering, and the iSchool. And today we have the pleasure of welcoming Sun-Ha Hong. And I'll just give you a brief intro. So Sun-Ha Hong is an assistant professor of communication at Fraser University. Before that, he was a Mellon postdoctoral fellow in the humanities at MIT's Comparative Media Studies and Writing Department. And he obtained his PhD at the Annenberg School for Communication at the University of Pennsylvania in 2016. So Sun-Ha's work analyzes fantasies, values, and sentimentalities surrounding big data and AI and other tech. And by mapping out historical and philosophical roots of how we think about objectivity and progress, his work examines the moral stakes of technological promises. So he is author of a forthcoming book, Technologies of Speculation, The Limits of Knowledge in a Data-Driven Society, New York University Press, coming out this year?
July.
Sun-Ha's current research analyzes the contested legacy of the Enlightenment in modern technoculture. Today's talk will draw on that research, and it's called Techno-Futures in Stasis. Does the longer title still apply?
We can go with this. Okay. Shorter the better.
In stasis. So please welcome Sun-Ha.
All right, thank you so much, everyone, for being here. Thank you, James, for the introductions. So let me get right into it. The work I'd like to share with you today, really, it's coiled around a single question, which is, actually, I'm lying, it's two questions. I'm lying already. So the first question, really, the simpler one, I think, is why is it, or how is it, that so many of our techno-futures, our imagined technological futures, the predictions, the prophecies, the bullish claims, how is it that they are often repeated, reprised, recycled across generations? Anyone who's seen the Blade Runner remake is going to know what I'm talking about. Or anyone who's been watching the recycling of prophecies around artificial intelligence between the Marvin Minsky days and between the Andrew Yang days is also going to know what I'm talking about. So there's a certain sense of repetition and the question of what social function that serves. But I think there's also a second, slightly more complicated question coiled around that, which is what else are we repeating? What else is being carried along in that imaginary when we repeat particular imaginations of the next innovation or the next breakthrough? So to show you what I mean, let me give you a very quick example of the kind of ritual celebrations of the new decade that we're getting at the moment. So if we look back to some of the coverage in January, one article told us that we're going to have a technological tsunami in the years in the coming decade. And their proof was that the 2010s had already been such a tsunami of its own. They said self-driving cars, iPads, Uber, their breadth is difficult to comprehend, and so surely, inevitably, we're going to have even more of a tsunami over the next 10 years. So the examples that they have picked bear scrutiny, right? So number one, we have self-driving cars, an idea that's been mooted and explored in various ways for at least 100 years, and currently remains at a pilot stage of an assisted rather than a fully automated technology. We have iPads, which were an organic extension of certain technological and design principles around earlier inventions such as the laptop and the PDA. And sure, iPads are great. And then we have Uber, a really cheap algorithmic taxi that is mostly cheap thanks to billions of artificially injected venture capital funding. So that's not to say that these technologies aren't significant. They are in a number of ways. But they don't necessarily show that we are undergoing an unprecedented tsunami, right? So there's sometimes an interesting disconnect or disjuncture between how we imagine progress as an almost transhistorical force, or a force that moves history of its own, and the kind of actual examples and pieces of evidence and illustrations that are mobilized to make this point. If you're not convinced yet, this is the particular image that article used to make their point. Who recognizes this cartoon? Anyone? Yell it out. What was it? The Jetsons, the lovely Jetsons. So this was a mid-20th century cartoon that was explicitly designed as a transposition of the ideal 1950s American suburban family onto a futuristic environment. And that really gets to my second point, or second suspicion that I'm trying to investigate. This idea that as much as we keep dreaming about technological innovations, perhaps there's a certain stagnation or stasis in the kind of social relations, the kind of ideas of work, of gender, of domestic labor, of the family that get carried along with the way in which we imagine these innovations. By the way, the Jetsons did that deliberately because the Jetsons was a derivative of the Flintstones, which obviously was about transposing the same 1950s family onto the Stone Age. So that's sort of the broader navigational map that I want to set out there for the ensuing discussion. And the specific examples that I'd like to use here to historically situate and contrast this is the difference between, or the similarities between, on one hand, smart technologies of the 2010s. I'm aware that I'm using an incredibly big label here, and I'll get to that. And ubiquitous computing in the 1990s. And often there are some explicit and many implicit callbacks between the two. And so I'd like to explore some of those resonances and some of the ways in which specific ideas around invention and innovation are being repeated and recycled. But again, what else about the way we imagine the social is being carried along with these ideas of technological innovations? So let me first start with ubiquitous computing, and let me just show you a quick visual example of what I mean.
The pace of business life is accelerating to a point where traditional companies just can't keep up with demands. The kind of companies that will succeed in the next 2 decades will integrate powerful communications technology, and churning out information will be the primary means of taking care of business.
The 90s are great, aren't they? So there you see Mark Weiser, who was chief technologist at Xerox PARC over the 1990s, and he's widely recognized as the founding father of Ubicom. He had a very specific and purposeful role that he embraced in coining ubiquitous computing and making it into something of a household buzzword during the 90s until his untimely death in 1999. So in that video, you see Weiser with his suspenders, so you know you can date him that way. And he's with his colleagues at Xerox PARC offices demonstrating one example of what he thought would be an Ubicom future. And I'm not going to get too much into the details of the specific technological protocols that they were investigating, like they were trying to look into RFID signals, they were trying to look at certain wireless protocols. I mean, we can talk more about that later in Q&A, but what I'm focusing on here is the vision of the future, the vision of technology, the vision of a technological life as promised through these kinds of texts. This is another example of internal design concept from Mark Weiser's archives. And here I think you get the idea, right? So there's a lot of this about Ubicom notebook that recalls or reminds us of certain design principles and hopes and dreams around smart technologies today. There was this idea that technology should become more embodied, more seamless. It should disappear into the woodwork. And it should be smart in the sense that it should always be able to observe you, anticipate what you want, and serve you in this kind of very, very smooth way. And so some of the HCI-ish considerations, here you see they wanted the laptop to inflate when full of data, so they were very concerned about gentle haptic feedback. They really liked the idea of certain skeuomorphic design principles on the right. So here they wanted to make it look like one of those over-elaborate secret diaries when you were 8. That's the kind of thing that it sort of reminds you of, but with a PCMI card in there as well. So just giving us an idea of what kind of things Ubicomp was dreaming about. But for me, the key part of Ubicomp is not necessarily a specific product or invention, because there weren't a lot of those, not yet in the 90s anyway. The live board, which is the remote connected whiteboard that you just saw in action in the video, that is probably one of the only explicitly Ubicomp products that made it onto the market before Weiser had passed away. Now, Ubicomp remains an active research agenda to this day, and there is a lot of substantial research that goes on, some of which has flowed into, again, the Internet of Things and other associated efforts over the decades. So I'm not saying that this research went nowhere or that it produced nothing, but I'm trying to highlight the extent to which over the 1990s it had this kind of outsized existence as a social actor in the form of a technological culture. And most of all, it had a textual presence rather than an infrastructural or presence as code. Mark Weiser, personally, his most famous legacy vis-a-vis Ubicomp was not a specific patent. It was not a specific piece of technological invention or product. It was a widely read article in the Scientific American called The Computer for the 21st Century. It was explicitly written as a manifesto, so very much in the tradition of Vannevar Bush's As We May Think in the Atlantic in 1945. So there's that textual presence. It's a presence of a regulatory ideal. However, Mark Weiser was very bullish about how Ubicomp is more or less inevitable given the way technology is going, and how we should embrace it, and how we can and should bring it into the present very, very quickly by putting all of our funding and research efforts and public enthusiasm into it. Sound familiar? That's what we're doing with IoT. That's what we're doing with AI. That's what we're doing with deep learning, so on and so forth. Now, of course, things aren't quite that simple. This is an example of Mark Weiser's first major Ubicomp grant proposal to DARPA, following very much in the Silicon Valley tradition of getting your money from the US military. And he is able to promise that by December 1993, this work ends, the future begins. Apparently, you could write that and still get a grant in 1993. Good old days, right? Of course, the future did not begin in 1993. In 1994, Weiser went back to DARPA with a new grant proposal, and in there he wrote 1997 is when the work would end and the future would begin. I think he knew that the future was not going to begin in 1997, but that was the game that he was playing. So, first of all, there's this constant cycle of repetition. There's a constant cycle of kicking the can down the road, right? Things never happen quite as quickly as Marvin Minsky tells you or Mark Weiser tells you. At the same time, though, there's the thing that I mentioned about the latent imagination of the social. What else are we packaging into this deferred technological future that gets dragged along with it? So let me show you a couple of examples along those lines. From the same video as before, this is an illustration in 1997 of what the office of the 21st century, you know, the century that we live in, the great future, flying cars and all that. Well, this is what they thought it would look like.
Okay. Computer, today's schedule?
Systems like these don't exist yet, but they're not far off. The electronic office is being turned into reality right now at R&D centers around the world.
So there's a sense in which some of that, I guess, has come true and some of that hasn't. Now, of more interest to me is, again, what they are imagining about the workplace beyond the technological intervention. So this is another example from the Palo Alto Weekly in 1992. And again, it was the day in the life of a future UbiComp worker. In this case, a worker they named Chris. And if you go through the hypothetical day of the UbiComp Chris, you learn a few things. So they talk about how Chris would get to work, and when she gets into the elevator is going to take her automatically to the 6th floor in our case, because it already has been tracking you and it already knows where your office is. It already knows you go to the 6th floor every day. And that is construed not in terms of surveillance or what kind of data needs to be gathered or what kind of behind the scenes communication needs to happen. No, it's depicted as this kind of sheer frictionless convenience. Now, while she's in the elevator, the screen lights up and she gets a message from her boss saying something along the lines of, "Hey, Chris, could you email me with your project-related files by this afternoon?" So there's no privacy. You're getting that in the elevator screen. And Chris is able to press a button on the side of the elevator and add that message onto her to-do list. So again, we can look at this in terms of what aspects of it are being replicated in some IoT and smart home research today. But my question there would also be, well, what about the things in our workplace that stay the same? What about the fact that we're still sending emails? We're still going to meetings all the time. We're still spending most of our time as a white-collar office worker creating and curating and sending documents that usually nobody ends up reading anyway. Apparently that wasn't worth innovating. What was worth innovating was just making the whole process a little bit faster and more efficient. It's also worth noting what kind of user is being interpolated again and again in these thought experiments. It is usually the relatively affluent, well-educated, tech-savvy, white-collar worker in relatively upper stages of management. In other words, people very much like Mark Weiser himself and the people that he worked with at Xerox PARC. And they did have a very conscious strategy of dogfooding as opposed to innovation. I can get into that more in the Q&A. But the point here is, again, what remains the same in this imagined picture and what changes? The other side of this kind of conversation was the kitchen and of domestic work. There was a really great deal of focus on figuring out how we could make housework quicker and more efficient and more convenient, which is an obsession that continues to this day in smart technologies. And so you can look at the smart fridge, which really has gone through reboots and relaunches and rehype pretty much every year for at least the last 20 years. So you see the Samsung Family Hub here, 2019 version, but then you can find the Electrolux screen fridge in 1999 that they promised was the world's first internet-connected refrigerator. And again, what is striking is the similarity in the promotional rhetoric. It's also the similarity in the design. So the kind of behind-the-scenes protocols and the kinds of chips used, that might change a lot actually, but the end result is often very, very similar in terms of what kind of functions they are supposed to provide to you. The only difference is that the screen gets a lot bigger, basically. And you can even go back further. You can even go back further and still detect certain traces of this stasis or this kind of conservatism. This is a very well-known example at this stage. Writers like Paul Durish and Genevieve Bell have discussed it. The Honeywell kitchen computer of 1969 with the wonderful tagline, "If she can only cook as well as Honeywell can compute." So again, this is a very, and I mean that ironically, right? So this is a just making sure. So this is a very Jetsons-like image, isn't it? Right? We have the very quintessential 1950s, idealized 1950s suburban American housewife. And again, what is notable is the degree to which all of the social relations and cultural meanings and power relations around domestic work are often retained in a similar manner, even as the imagined technological intervention is replaced progressively by more impressive and technologically advanced gadgets. And of course, scholars like Ruth Cohen have looked into the history of new electric and other advanced cooking and kitchen technologies into the American home over the first half of the 20th century. And people like Cohen have found that it didn't necessarily result in a radical reduction of housework for the housewife. Right? It didn't necessarily result in a radical emancipation of the woman relative to the kitchen, because a lot of the time you spend, the time you saved thanks to a better rice cooker, for example, would often be filled up with new cultural practices around, let's say, a more intense ideal of childcare and child rearing. So that's not always to say that it evens out or that nothing changes, but that there are questions to be asked about where the innovation is hitting and where the innovation is leaving intact. Just a couple of quick things I want to note that go back even further just to make the point. Astra Taylor, who has written extensively about what she calls foxtomation, or the degree to which automation often also requires non-automated forms of labor. She points out that if you look at the Hoover catalog in the 1920s, you will find a smart vacuum, essentially. And it's a smart vacuum because it collects data. What kind of data does it collect? You simply breathe into that gigantic face mask, and your carbon dioxide emissions would go into that massive bag on your back, and you would measure essentially how much energy you have expended while vacuuming the floor. As far as I know, this was never actually built. It was a prototype. However, it is again notable how it is again the same kind of housewife, and the cultural meanings and social relations around the act of vacuuming is left alone. The only thing is that you get a bit of data-driven insight for God knows what reason. One last example along the same lines. This is from a set of postcards produced by Paris-based illustrators around 1899. They intended these postcards, called In the Year 2000, for the Paris World Exhibition, 1901 or 1900, somewhere around there. Due to cost concerns, they never got to print and display these postcards in the exhibition. Very sad story. And they went away into obscurity until somebody named Isaac Asimov happened to come across them, collect them, and write his own commentary and release it as a coffee table book called Future Days in 1986, I believe. And I think Asimov's commentary on this particular postcard is very instructive of, again, this generational repetition of the same bottleneck in the imaginary. First, we note that in the postcard, you have, again, basically the proto-Roomba, right? This is, again, a kind of a smart robotic vacuum. But you still need the housemaid addressed in the same way on hand to govern and manage this particular contraption. And Asimov says, listen, there was a time when the mistress of the house could basically outsource all of this work to the servant, and then she wouldn't have to do any of this. And so this invention is quite imperfect, Asimov explains. However, writing in the 1980s, he says, maybe by the year 2000, or possibly 2015, at least he's hedging himself there, we could picture intelligent robots doing it all. And so for me, there's this uncanny equation of the human servant and the machinic servant as both forms of outsourcing unpleasant labor while maintaining so much of the labor relation intact. And I want us to carry that sense of that invisible servant with us into that historical comparison, because that, I would argue, it was such a dominant part of the popular imagination of Ubicomp. It was filled with depictions like this in the San Jose Mercury News in 1991. And it's like looking at a still out of the movie Idiocracy, if you remember that. So it's this kind of ultimate paean to convenience. You can sit in your smarter couch. I don't know how smart it is, but you can get a shoe shiner for whatever reason in your own home. You can get a soft drink delivered. You can order a haircut. You can order pizza with pepperoni and anchovies. And so there is this massive focus on a particular ideal of convenience for sovereignty, convenience for individual choice, and of course the interpolation of a particular kind of well-equipped user, the individual consumer, as the key point around which all of these technologies would revolve. And so that's the point at which I would like to challenge some of those assumptions and to point out the ways in which those assumptions have not necessarily proven germane as we take some of these ideas around Ubicom and we pass into the world of smart technologies and the Internet of Things in the 2010s. And the argument that I'd like to suggest here, it's still a work in progress, but I'd like to suggest here is that when I say there is stasis and stagnation in this imaginary, I don't mean that the pursuit of these technologies will enforce a static world. Because to say that would be to accept that this technological future is of a form of literal prediction. And I don't think that's always the case, right? I think it's often a very strategic and performative maneuver that we undertake in order to organize funding and belief and passions and enthusiasm. And so static imaginaries don't necessarily mean that they don't change anything about gender or workplace or so on and so forth. The problem, though, is that the staticity means that we create persistent blind spots in our imaginary about what technological futures do. And in that blind spot, we become ill-equipped for the kind of changes that actually happen to our work, to our jobs, to our homes, to our family relations, to our daily habits when some of these technologies really do hit the market. So in making that point, I mean, this whole thing is really a very Joseph Weizenbaum kind of analysis. Joseph Weizenbaum, of course, being one of the pioneers of AI research, he's behind the ELIZA chatbot in 1964. And so about 50 years ago, he came back and had a warning to us, which was to say that when we pursue these kinds of computing technologies, when we pursue the future of AI to change the world, what we often end up doing is not so much changing the world through our computers, but changing ourselves and the world around us to make it more legible and compatible and friendly to the still imperfect computers around us. So there is a certain reversal of the imagined user that I would like to explore here. This idea that we keep imagining a technological future in which I am the primary user. But of course, if you look at some of the surveillance capitalism systems now, it's clear that you are not the primary user a lot of the time. And that has implications for, again, the difference between smart technologies that are supposed to disappear because they want to be your invisible servant, like proxies and heirs of the housemaid. There's a difference between that imagination and what we get with smart technologies today, where you are having to change in certain ways to make sure that you are legible to the systems that you now depend on. So I'll elaborate this and get into this further because I'm aware that this is still a contentious argument. And to do that, I want to now draw on a little bit of my research that went into the book around smart technologies. And again, that's such a broad umbrella. So in order to manage that a little bit, I want to focus on one particular aspect of self-tracking technologies. So stuff like Fitbit, right, Bedit, Apple Watch, so on and so forth. This promise that with the advent of miniaturized sensors and smartphones and with new forms of data analytics, the promise that you will know yourself, that the machines will know you better than you know yourself, right? That's sort of the buzzword. And I'm focusing on this area because this is the area where the early rhetoric, even well into 2014 or 2015, the promise was that this was how we're going to democratize the technology. There was an explicit argument from people like Gary Wolf, the Wired veteran, the founder of the Quantified Self community. There was the explicit promise that this is how we will take big data and use it to actually empower ordinary people to know themselves better by tracking themselves and creating these kinds of data-driven decision-making systems for what you eat and when you run and so on and so forth. And I don't want to say that's all untrue. I think to a large degree it is true, but there's also another dimension to that when these technologies get rolled out into a mass market, rolled out into the mass market. So let me show you what I mean. On the left, we see a very, very typical example of a self-tracking technology. It's Bedit, which was later bought out by Apple, I believe. And the whole point of Bedit is it'll measure things like heart rate variability and motion in your bed while you sleep, and then it'll deliver to you a sleep score telling you how well you must have slept, right? And so the irony here is that the machine is going to track you literally while your consciousness has turned off for the night. It's communing with what Catherine Hales calls the non-conscious dimension or stratum of your somatic self. And then when you wake up, depending on what kind of person you are, you don't always have the tools to break down these numbers and correlations to really know what the numbers mean. There's a sense of waking up to be told what the truth of your sleep is, and you having to adapt to this information to make decisions about your life. Well, that becomes a little bit trickier when we go to something like People Keeper. People Keeper will track your experiences with human interactions. So you'll meet your family, you'll meet your friends, you'll meet your PhD advisor, and each time you will log exactly how you feel about each interaction. Over time, it will give you statistical correlations and thus recommendations about who are the toxic people in your life you should cut out, and who are the people that really bring joy to your life. So it's kind of this Marie Kondo logic. Now, People Keeper was, in fact, the creation of two artists in residence at Carnegie Mellon University. So they had some critical notion of what they were doing. It was also a widely available app on the App Store. You could download and use it. And also, this is the horizon of potential use, right? So we're going to see other variants of this kind of stuff in the coming years. Left the best one for the last, Spreadsheet, which is sadly defunct now, but there are other similar apps to be found. Spreadsheet is a system where it's a smartphone app. You download it. It makes use of the sensors already on your smartphone, like the accelerometer. You simply toss it on your bed while you have sex. It will listen to you, and it will deliver stats such as duration, thrust per minute, and decibel peak. So, great stuff. And the reason I point this out is these statistics are clearly not coming from some philosophical reflection of what is worth measuring about sex. I hope not. Clearly, most likely, it is coming from the other way around, which is where you simply measure what you can given the sensors already available on the typical smartphone, and then you try to retroactively rationalize and visualize that data to make it profitable and hopefully useful to somebody out there. Right? And so my point here is that what is measurable often starts to take a practical priority over what is not measurable about our lives, about our friendships, about our sex life, right? And that is already slightly different from the kind of convenience for sovereignty relationship that had been so dominant in the popular imagination of ubiquitous computing. And things get even more complicated when we realize that what gets developed for self-tracking does not stay with self-tracking. There is a rapid cross-contextual control creep as the technical and design principles and the consumer habits brokered through one context quickly bleed into other contexts. Why? Because you're looking for ways to be profitable. So you have something like Amazon Ring, which has actually existed since 2013. They were just bought out by Amazon in 2018. That's when they got big and started getting all those negative headlines. And Amazon Ring obviously is a transition where you're no longer just filming and datafying yourself through these kinds of technologies. You are putting cameras on your home in order to track other people. And then we also find out that Amazon Ring, out of its own initiative, will then share a lot of this data with local law enforcement. They will also send a lot of this data to third-party human contractors who will look at your Amazon Ring feed and pixel hunt as a way to improve some of the computer vision and detection systems, right? Which is the same reason that they listen to your smart assistant conversations, right? They need the human work behind the scenes at the moment to improve the algorithms. But my point here, or my question here is, what happens when you get to a situation where certain kinds of users are the kinds of people who buy and install and use the Ring, and certain kinds of people are the kinds of people who end up on the other side of the Ring, right? Who are the kinds of people they end up getting caught on the camera, sometimes without their knowledge, sometimes having that footage be passed on to the police, sometimes have that footage be passed between each other, the Amazon Ring users, who have been documented as sometimes making incredibly racial judgments about what they must be seeing in their camera, right? I mean, there's widely reported examples of people on that app saying things like, I see this suspicious black guy near my house, like if I shoot him now, then is it okay? Is it stand your ground? And people talking about whether it's not stand your ground. But they're talking, the way in which they're talking about it. So the kind of social sorting and the kind of division of different kinds of users is already very, very different from the situation of convenience for sovereignty, right? And even if we get away from the crime aspect, on the right you see a John Hancock insurance ad, and that's because John Hancock has been one of the earliest partners with Fitbit for trying to integrate Fitbit and its data collection systems into the business of insurance. At this stage, it takes this kind of form. So you might get an Apple Watch and get into John Hancock's Vitality Insurance program, and you give John Hancock your measurements, basically. So every time you run, it logs it for you. You send that data, you send that private running data to John Hancock. They'll measure it, they'll match it up against your gender, your age, and your weight to see how much exercise you have done relative to the recommended norm, however that's calculated. And using that, they'll offer you some subsidies on your Apple Watch purchase. So, all right, that's a discount. That's like a coupon. We like coupons, right? Of course, the horizon of potential use there is we can easily imagine a scenario where this kind of data collection is then utilized to calculate insurance premiums. That's the obvious next step that is currently legally very, very difficult to do, but that's the obvious next step. Other insurance companies like Progressive and State Farm also collect car telemetry units. Companies like BP America are now officially experimenting with programs where they give their employees Fitbit and then they collect that data as part of their employee management and surveillance, right? So we're going into very different kinds of situations. We're going into a situation where I would say there's a bit of a reversal of the imagined user. And it's the kind of from this kind of sovereign individual to the data broker, to the advertiser, to the developer, to the big tech, to the police and law enforcement. And I would argue again, I'm not necessarily saying that a computer scientist like Mark Weiser had to have anticipated all of these users. For one thing, this is not exactly the same thing as Ubicom. My point is that it is an example of how the way in which we continue to imagine technological futures often leads to these persistent blind spots and limitations in what kinds of things get left out. What kinds of things get left out, and then we come back to them later and say, oh no, that was an unintended consequence. And here I'm really in line with Sheila Jasanoff's critique of that notion, and her point was that when we say unintended consequence, that's a nice way of abducting responsibility, because implicit in that is this argument of we could not reasonably have seen this coming, we cannot be responsible for it, and it shouldn't stop us from future innovations, even if future innovations may have the same unintended consequences. Why? They are not predictable. They are not intended, and therefore they should not be part of our regular decision making. And so that's Jasanoff's critique, and I'm really on board with that in this particular context, because again, I think that's one of the ways in which our technological futures get repeated and repeated, and we're not giving it enough of an incentive to shake things up and start imagining the future in different kinds of ways. So, just to start to wrap things up, I just want to go back quickly to ubiquitous computing and make a couple of contrasts here. Because the irony of this is that people like Mark Weiser actually tried. They were very, very conscientious. Mark Weiser himself read a lot of philosophy and humanistic work. He was very interested in Heidegger. He was very interested in phenomenology. He read Charles Peirce. And he also worked, of course, with Lucy Suchman, who was working at Xerox PARC in the same building complex during some years of the 1990s. So he was very serious about thinking through how humans would use technologies and how we can make technologies that help people. So it's not for the want of good intentions that this happens. You see here one of the illustrations from John Seeley Brown, Mark Weiser's boss, who was apparently a good illustrator. And so this idea of technology disappearing into the background, they had this idea, people like Weiser had this idea, that disappearance would really be an empowering thing for the user. So there's no critique of the black box of algorithms here. There's no critique of invisible surveillance. It's this idea, this imagination, that disappearance means computers aren't distracting you or getting in your way or irritating you with blue screens of death. It's this idea that it will create a tabula rasa of the social in which you, the empowered individual, can do whatever you want and whatever you need, and technology will simply help you do it. So it's that assumption that without technology getting in the way, there is nothing to stop you. There is no historical power relations. There is nothing like that. it is all just fine. And that's one of the reasons that Mark Weiser was very much against competing visions at the time. For a long time, he didn't like laptops because he didn't believe that computers should be these discrete objects. He thought that any room that you walk into, there's just a computer on the wall, or rather, the wall is the computer, right? So he was very concerned about figuring this out. You see here a letter that he sent a magazine saying, please do not associate me with this idea of intimate computing. I think technology should be invisible, rather the opposite. Also, you spelled my name wrong, and I'm really angry about that, so I'm not going to subscribe to your magazine. He could be prickly on occasions. But this tabula rasa imagination, I would argue, again has its blind spot, which is this idea that actually when you clear away certain technologies and when you put them into the woodwork, when you make technologies disappear, you don't end up with a blank slate of the social. You actually end up with a topology of asymmetric power relations. And an example of that, a concrete example of the implications, is how these people talk about privacy. And so on one hand, we have an example where Mark Weiser is drafting for the Scientific American. He knows this is going to be big. Al Gore is writing for that issue. Alan Kay is writing for that issue. He knows it's going to be big. So he writes a draft, and he sends it to his Xerox PARC friends and says, can you give me some feedback? And one piece of handwritten feedback, I think this is from Mark Weimer, but this is my guess based on the handwriting. It's really hard to say. Says, somewhere you need to at least acknowledge that privacy issues are a major concern with this kind of technology. Point taken, and therefore, afterwards, not just Weiser, but most people in the Ubicom space, they do at least acknowledge the privacy issue. And that's about as far as it goes. It's usually an afterthought, right? And it's usually construed of as like a cybersecurity concern, right? A technical problem that you can solve with better security measures. And I would suggest that one of the reasons that things like privacy get shunted away is again because there is this focus on assuming the empowered user that wants unrestricted flow of data in order to get all the knowledge and use that to make whatever decisions they wish. And that really is almost completely replicated in a lot of earlier discussions around smart technologies and self-tracking, at least until the tech clash really hit home around 2016. So on the right, you see a Wired article that was evangelizing for not just the quantified self, but the quantified us. So it's this idea that it's us and not them. And so you have a Kleins Perkins investor writing for Wired, saying that sharing your personal asset may be the best decision of your life because the privacy laws are not perfect. None of this is ever perfect. Data breaches will happen, but let's not let perfect be the enemy of the good. That really reminds me of the recent quote from the Clearview AI investor who said, oh, this might lead to a dystopian future or something, but you know, it's gonna happen anyway, so I might as well be the one to do it. Well, there's a quote from an old Joseph Weizenbaum interview where, and this is me quoting him, and he literally said, listen, that is a horrible, horrible excuse. That's like saying women get raped every single day, so it might as well be me. That is how bad it is. So that's the specific way in which Weizenbaum wanted to really shock his colleagues, often his colleagues, into saying, no, this is really not right. The example that I would use is to say that's like ExxonMobil saying we're going to keep pumping oil because somebody else is going to do it anyway, right? So this narrative of inevitability and its perniciousness, I think, comes through in these ironies of staticity or of static imaginaries. And so time-wise, I'm just going to wrap up here, but I guess what I'm trying to say through all of this is that I'm trying to broadly situate these technological futures and say, can we hold these kinds of repetitions or blind spots accountable in a way that's not necessarily about blaming someone like Mark Weiser individually? I don't think that's the point. In a way that we don't stop repeating these mistakes as a society. And to me, a major part of that is questioning the kind of values that we often use as a default. So ideas like innovation or ideas like progress as an inevitability, ideas like convenience as something that is surely a neutral good that everybody wants. Ideas like objectivity as something that we can surely get to and is surely going to improve all forms of decision making. So for me, that's what this is really about. It's about saying that technology stories, the stories that technoculture tells about itself, the tests that it gives itself, it's not going to betray the technology. And we need other, more external forms of critique that sometimes do a kind of historical comparison that we usually are encouraged to forget about in order to try and see some different lines of analysis, very much in line with critiques of instrumental reason that has a 100-year-old tradition, right? And so that's what I've really tried to do here, and it's also something that I try to do in the book. Some of the research I've just included in the talk, but in the book itself, of course, I try to unspool this around the idea of objective knowledge vis-a-vis big data, and I talk about this idea of honeymoon objectivity to describe this kind of repeated fascination, this idea that, oh, this time with this technology, we're going to have objectivity, we're going to get it right, let's just wait for the next version. Let's just wait for the next upgrade. So I'll stop there. Thank you so much. And please, any suggestions, questions, anything I wasn't clear about, anything you want to push back on and critique, that would really be a huge learning moment for me as well. So I really welcome that. So thank you so much. Yes?
Thank you for this beautiful talk. I love the focus on the imagination, and because everything starts in the imagination. And so I wondered, it's 50 years on of this kind of this one imagination that is seated in certain dynamics. It's hard to break out and think of what else our imagined futures could be. So I'm wondering where do you see the ability to sort of uncouple from this imagination, and what else can we be seeding our imaginations with?
Yeah, so one caveat would be that, of course, the way I construct this narrative is biased towards emphasizing the similarities or the continuities of these imagination. But these are not the only fantasies that we have peddled in the last 50 years. So that's a necessary caveat. That said, I think one of the problems or one of the recurrent patterns is that well, maybe if you have the same kinds of people with the same kinds of training in the same kind of environment, trying to solve the same kind of problem construed in a similar way, then maybe it's no wonder that as smart and well-intentioned as they usually are, they're going to come up with similar kinds of solutions. And that's what I meant by the whole dogfooding aspect. So dogfooding, of course, being that colloquial term for, you invent what you eat, like you're testing your own inventions on yourself to figure out the problems. And there are numerous advantages to that, right? And Xerox PARC was well known at the time as being really dedicated to it. So people like Weiser and his colleagues were encouraged to look around them and think of solutions to the problems they face, because that's what they know best. And again, I see some of the pros of that, right? And so that's why they, for example, focus so much on the office. They wanted to figure out problems with themselves having meetings, their own coffee pot, so they got a smart coffee pot, things like that. But at some stage, there's a huge limitation to that. You can be Mark Weiser, you can try to read really, really widely, but there's only so much you can do. And I also don't want to sound like I'm squarely laying it at the feet of, like, say, engineers and entrepreneurs and saying, you guys need to read more and do this and do this and do this. Because then we get into the structural question of, okay, but they were not trained to think of those problems. They're not being paid to think of those problems. They're often actively disincentivized from worrying too much about those problems, e.g. Stephen Shapin's study of venture capitalists and how venture capitalists are they reward entrepreneurs who perform a particular combination of confidence and arrogance. And that particular combination often is all about being able to show how your thing is going to scale up to the next level of population. It's not scaled around trying to think through different kinds of users and all the train wrecks that can happen. So I know that's not a solution. I think it's an identification of a problem where, no, it's not just about blaming the engineers. It's not just about blaming Mark Weiser. It's about the economic incentives and the institutional training that continues even today, despite certain exceptions. It continues to say, don't worry about it so much. That's an unintended consequence. Did you want to?
Yeah, thank you for that talk. It is really imaginative itself. My question is, in the book, do you kind of come down to ladder of abstraction? Most of the kind of examples that you're using are at the hardware application level to think about sort of information encoding, because it seems to me that there's a lot of similarities between this gap that we see in the early 90s to contemporary settings of technology development. It is similar to the semantic web, right? Early like promises of Tim Berners-Lee saying we can simply build these inference engines based on the way that we structure information such that we can predict, which is the same promise that's being made of machine learning applications. So is that addressed in the book, or does it like come down from, say, just the hardware level?
So what I would say is, one answer, which is about what is actually in the book, and often my focus is on when the technologically built system hits an unexpected social use. So the book itself, for example, the Ubicom stuff is a little bit new. The book really connects the self-tracking aspect to state surveillance systems, the Snowden affair, NSA systems. And one of the ironies there is, you know, if you get into the nitty-gritty of certain NSA surveillance systems, and let's say how they conceive of the selector, because they're not surveilling people, they're surveilling selectors, which are things like email addresses, which are not tied to a single person. And then that becomes weird when that particular way of organizing information meets with the legal organization of information, which says, e.g., you cannot spy on Americans, right? Or you can only get a legal remit to surveil a particular kind of person. So it's in those kinds of weird contact points and the disjunctures that occur, that's really the area that I focus on. I think what you're pointing to is also this historical question of, you know, what are the kinds of assumptions we made about how information can and should be organized in different stages of the development of the web and development of network technologies? And to be honest, that's not the analysis you're going to find in that particular book. Regretfully, I do think it should be done. And I think, again, part of that story is how some of the idiosyncrasies or contradictions or difficult decisions that have to be made at the coding level, or even some of the assumptions that go into NLP now, those things don't always disappear when you look at the nicely packaged product that's being sold to the public. Sometimes that really does get translated in unexpected ways. I don't know where to begin. Let's.
You got it.
No, it's okay.
I'll keep my answers shorter. Please go ahead.
Okay. Actually, I hope this is really quick. I really love this talk, and throughout the talk, the thing that was super on my mind is the book Faces at the Bottom of the Well by Derek Bell. And the subtitle is The Permanence of Racism, and the idea is that racism is permanent, and we can attempt to kind of solve it or not be racist, but basically every attempt will basically just bake it deeper under the surface, but like you were describing, maintain the same power dynamics, but just make it more invisible, difficult to detect and then difficult to fight. And so he says that racism is permanent, and it's very like US-centric, so he says that racism is permanent particularly in the US because it is necessary for this country to maintain the stability that it does, and so basically saying that there's a lot of investment in making sure that racism upholds in the US. So I'm wondering if what your thoughts are about this recycling of ideas not being a lack of imagination, but instead by design being it's not advantageous to emancipate the woman from the kitchen or the worker from the office.
I love that question because you're pointing out a thing that's really important for me to better clarify. And I think it's that, you know, you use the phrase the lack of imagination. And I think, again, if it is a lack of imagination, it's not the kind of lack of imagination where you're like, hey, Mark, did you want to just sit down and think about this for a second? And he'll be like, oh, yeah. Like, that's clearly not the kind of lack that we're talking about, right? We're thinking about the broader incentives that goes beyond individual inventors or engineers that make it unprofitable or unlikely to think of certain kinds of things. And so what I mentioned about venture capital is one thing, but also it's things like, I mean, so in terms of this book, I think the argument is that, I mean, surveillance is fundamental to modern systems of governance. So one of the problems with the conversations around the Snowden affair was there was a certain strand of liberal critique that said we need to dismantle the surveillance state, we need to get rid of surveillance. And I understood and agreed with a lot of the underlying reasons behind that call. But of course, you also realize that systems of surveillance is concomitant with, coterminous with, what we understand as modern systems of government, right? So I'm not saying that's a good necessarily, I'm just saying that is what it is. And then you have to ask, well, what are the different kinds of surveillance that we could have in our society? How could there be different systems that aren't perfect, that don't get rid of faces at the bottom of the well, that don't get rid of like the deep-seated problem, but what is a way of attacking that problem that doesn't just pretend that it's not there and doesn't pretend that we're not making it worse? And the other side of this thing is also that, you know, like people like Weiser, I'm sure that he knew what he was doing to an extent, right? He understood that he needed to hype the technology to an extent. And there's that history of AI research where people like Marvin Minsky, who are now remembered as these incredibly powerful beings, but of course, historically, there was a point at which he and his colleagues needed to justify this strange new research that grew very quickly after the mid-60s. And he needed to get funding. He needed to show that his vision of AI research and those like it were going to lead the way. And so making these kinds of huge, massive televised prophecies that he probably knew were not going to exactly come true, that was part of the game, right? And as part of this, I was talking to Paul Durish, who had worked briefly at Xerox PARC when Mark Weiser was around. And one of his ideas was that Weiser was trying to solve a management problem and a PR problem as much as a technical one when he came up with this idea of Ubicomp. Why? Xerox PARC was a legendary R&D center credited with a lot of development around the graphical user interface and other bases of personal computing in the 70s, as many of us know. And then the narrative was that by the time Weiser comes along, the center had fallen into the doldrums a little bit. It was no longer at the forefront of innovation. So Weiser knew that he needed to do this kind of general's rallying cry to get people on board and get more smart people into the lab, so on and so forth. And so I think those things, I mean, it just shows me I really should have talked about it more. But these particular political exigencies or economic exigencies, I think really play a huge role in moving the needle or failing to move the needle in massively deep-seated historical problems. I mean, even quantification is a technology, right? So William Derringer's recent book, Calculated Values, I'll cut it here, I'm getting long, but basically argues that 17th century England, why did quantification become so prevalent at this point? And he says one of the reasons actually is a bunch of people wanted to screw their political opponent over, and they didn't have the traditional modes of argumentation available on their side, so they looked for a new and transgressive way to make their claims and justify them, and it just happened to be newfangled forms of statistics, right? So we know that quantification is a technology that necessarily reduces and strips away detail to get things done, but it also historically tends to emerge as a stick to beat people with, that people that you don't like. I'll stop there.
Can we just pause here because it is 5 o'clock and I know some people probably need to leave right now, so maybe we can reshuffle, and if you have a few minutes to stick around if there are any remaining questions that weren't answered.
Yeah, I can stick around, and anybody who needs to go now, thank you so much for being here. Thank you.